Hey everyone, thanks for checking out our Shin Megami Tensei retrospective. If you haven't seen any of the retrospectives I do here, I basically go through all the stuff in my collection. For me, it's a good chance to go through my collection. I've been curating it a lot recently, so it's nice to see what I've got and see what I might be missing that I want. And I like to use that as an opportunity to make these retrospectives and go through everything. So in this case, we're doing Shin Megami Tensei because Persona 5 is coming out, and that's going to be a huge hit for the series. In this case, we're going to go through the main series. So there's a lot of spin-offs and stuff. We'll get to them later. So for those that don't know, the Mega 10 series, as fans call it, is a series of Japanese RPGs. It started back with the Famicom, which we know as the NES, and it is a pretty hardcore series. The games are known for being notoriously difficult. There's a huge emphasis on fighting and collecting demons and using those in your party to fight. That's kind of a Pokemon angle to it, but it was in here first. And it has a really unique setting and themes that make it stand apart from other RPGs. Before we get started with this, I just want to mention a bit about the canon for Shin Megami Tensei. The games are loosely connected. You have to consider it more of a multiverse. There's a lot of what-if scenarios. There's a lot of different endings in the games, and if you try to spend all your time trying to figure out where everything fits in a timeline, it's not going to end well for you. So just play everything in isolation if you can. Note that there are some direct connections, but for the most part, just try and enjoy each game as an individual piece. The first game in the series to be released is Megami Tensei, which came out in Japan for the Famicom and personal computers in 1987. Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei is based on a novel by Aya Nishitani, and it is a really interesting read. It's a trilogy of 3 books called Digital Devil Story, and the first one, Megami Tensei, which I believe stands for Resurrection of the Goddess, is a weird mashup of horror, sci-fi, and, a pulp story. It's one of those, like, you could compare it to a B-movie kind of story, but one of those ones that's so fun that it gathers a cult following. It's really unique, especially for the time. There's a main focus on demons and summoning demons, but it takes place in a modern setting. And, the demons are summoned using computer programs, and there's a really interesting mix of, sci-fi elements and horror. The first game takes place in the 90s in Japan, and it stars the main character who writes a program that summons demons into the world. He does this to get revenge on certain people, but it ends up that some demons come over he can't control, and they end up invading Japan. So the story is about him trying to fight back against these demons. The game features first-person dungeons. So, those were really big at the time with games like Wizardry and other first-person PC games. They make the game pretty hard to navigate, but they're a staple for the first half of the series, so it's something you've got to get used to if you want to experience these games. A lot of the elements of the story and gameplay that we see later in the series were all introduced here. Megami Tensei 2 was a wholly original story created for the Famicom. It was released in 1990, and it takes place 35 years after Japan has been bombed. This game introduces a setting of the wasteland, which is used in many Shin Megami Tensei titles. So in this case, the world has basically been destroyed, and it's up to the last couple people who are around to defend against the demons that have invaded. In this case, the world was destroyed by a nuclear attack, so not necessarily by the demons, but they still become a major threat in the aftermath of that event. The 2 titles are completely unrelated to each other. The second one is more of an evolution of the gameplay of the first. Both Megami Tensei 1 and 2 have been remade for the Super Famicom. They come together on a single cart called Megami Tensei The Old Testament, and the graphics are updated, the story is updated, and it's just a different way to experience those titles. Neither the original versions or the update were released in English, so if you want to play these, you'll have to find translated versions. At this point, the series was still pretty unknown, even in Japan. It had its fans, but it wasn't quite the big thing that it would become later. So the developers put a lot of time and care into making the first game for the Super Famicom, which is Shin Megami Tensei. Released in 1992. It's basically an evolution of the first Megami Tensei game. It's not quite the same, but it could be considered a remake. Everything is updated. It still uses, a map screen and first-person dungeons and raising demons to fight for you as the main gameplay elements. But everything is just a lot nicer, obviously, with the added power of the Super Nintendo that was possible, but it was also just refined in gameplay and easier to play. The game was split into 2 parts. The first part is a 90s era Tokyo, and then it fast forwards to a wasteland world. The game was ported to many systems later, including the TurboGrafx CD, the Sega CD, and the PlayStation. I think I have a version here of the, which is this Mega CD version. The TurboGrafx CD version is known for just being a pretty straight port of the original game, whereas I think the Sega CD version added cutscenes and a couple different elements to make it a bit different. Jumping ahead a bit, in 2004, Japan had a cell phone RPG release called Shin Megami Tensei 20XDX. The game uses music and gameplay taken from Shin Megami Tensei 2 and If, which are upcoming games I'll talk about, but the game follows the lawful ending of Shin Megami Tensei 1, and it takes place between Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2. The game features a character getting a comp from a stranger and using that to summon and fight demons invading the world. In 2008, a prequel to that game was released called 20XDX Devil's Coliseum. It shows the past of some of the characters from that game. The game stars a set of twins. The girl twin gets possessed by a demon and sends the orphanage that she's living in into a demonic realm. After her brother gets a comp, he's able to summon demons and sets off to rescue her. They both sound really interesting, and I wish there was a way to play these games here, but because they were only mobile releases in Japan, there's probably a lot more work than just translating these. Next up we get Shin Megami Tensei 2. Basically just a sequel to the first game. It takes place decades after the story of the first game, but it has no real connection to the game. So just like the original two titles, they're not really connected. I think the first game had a bit of a splash in Japan. It started to get popular, but people still really didn't know about it. So the hype for the second game was real, and they wanted players to get into the second game without having played the first one. So I think that was a conscious decision to make something completely different. Like the first game, this one was ported to many CD consoles, and I think for both of these games there are now English versions you can get for iOS and Android possibly, and that's the only official English releases. I've got the two reproduction cards here because even though I love owning the originals, these are games that I want to play and I can't play them. So mostly I don't really care about reproduction cards, but I think these are cool ones to have for me personally. In 1994, the same year that Shin Megami Tensei 2 was released, we got Shin Megami Tensei If. It's a strange side story for the series. It takes place after the original game, but in an alternate world where, the world wasn't destroyed, so there is no wasteland, and it shows a different outcome of the first game. In Shin Megami Tensei If, a summoning program sends a high school into the Expanse, which is a demon world mentioned throughout the series. The player controls a student who gets a comp which allows him to summon demons and fight back. He has to explore the school and the nearby demonic towers. The game's big theme is the 7 deadly sins, which is used throughout the towers. If setting and character were really popular, and it was used as a basis for the Persona series. It was also ported to several CD systems, so there's quite a few ways to play it, but there's no official English release of this one. Before we get into some other things, let's quickly talk about the manga. Shin Megami Tensei has a ton of manga series for it, but very few have come over here. There was a full manga series for the original Shin Megami Tensei If, which would have been a cool way to experience that since the game didn't come out over here. But instead, Tokyo Pop put out Shin Megami Tensei Con, which is a really notable series because it's the only official Shin Megami Tensei series to come out over here that's not Persona. And it is a sequel to Shin Megami Tensei If, which is kind of an annoying thing because since we haven't played If and we don't know the story for If, this is pretty heavily reliant on understanding what happened in that game. Also, Tokyo Pop only put out 2 volumes before they decided to discontinue it, which is a shame because there's 9 volumes total. There were also some anime OVAs released in Japan. The first was Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, which followed the original novel pretty closely. It was never released officially over here, but the UK did get a bad subbed English version. So that's hard to track down, but I'm sure you can find subbed versions online somewhere if you go looking. The second was Shin Megami Tensei Tokyo Revelation, which did come out over here dubbed and subbed. Manga Entertainment put out a VHS copy back when it was released, and much later they put out this DVD copy. When I first saw it, actually a friend bought it for me for my birthday way back in the day, the original VHS copy, and we watched it and were not impressed. I didn't understand what the hell was going on with it. I was young at the time. And I didn't really appreciate it. And then later, when I got into collecting the games, I found out, oh, this is part of that. And of course, now it starts to make sense, all this weird demonic stuff and this computer summoning stuff. So I think for any Shin Megami Tensei fan, it's worth picking up. It's a really interesting part of the series. The original series doesn't get much love over here. It's really Persona that gets all the love. So it's cool to have stuff like this come out over here. Next up is a game I got really recently because I had never even heard about it before, but it is Shin Megami Tensei 9, which is the first Shin Megami Tensei game in 3D. All the characters and dungeons are in full 3D instead of the first-person view you would see in other games. It is an Xbox exclusive, which is really strange because, the Xbox didn't do well at all in Japan, and actually the original Xbox did all right over here, but I don't think it did well enough that, they should put an exclusive Shin Megami Tensei game on it. This game never came out over here in English. It's the only import Xbox game I own, and I'm gonna have to hack my system to play it, but at some point me and Cam will do a let's play of it, so we'll get there someday. It came out in 2002, and it takes place between Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2. So it's weird that it's called 9 when it's actually 1.5, but it is a really interesting thing. It was originally conceived as an online-only game, which I think makes sense that it would be on the Xbox because that was the system that had the most capable online features. But it never got there, so they decided let's add a single player mode, and then they decided let's release a single player mode separately and we'll work on the online mode later, and that online mode was cancelled and never came out. Although the assets I think were reused and the idea was reused for Shin Megami Tensei Imagine, which was an MMO that was released in 2007, and it was available in English, so I remember playing that when it came out. It lasted a lot longer than I thought. I only played it for a couple months, and I never heard about it again after that. But it seems like the English servers were up until 2014, and the Japanese servers were only shut down last year, so that's a decent run. It sported the same visual style as Shin Megami Tensei 9 and 3, but it had, and it had all the classic tropes of the series, but, it's kind of a shame that that was the only way to experience it, and not many people knew about it. Shin Megami Tensei 9 itself mostly takes place in a virtual world. You go in through computers and you battle demons that are, within the cyber world. So it's an interesting, different take on that. And, well, we'll see if it's worth checking out when I get to that Let's Play. Alright, next up is Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne. This was the first Shin Megami Tensei game to ever come out over here. At the time, it was completely unknown. It sports a really cool art style, which really made it stand out from other RPGs on the PS2. This is the updated version. The original game was released in Japan in 2003, and then later a more complete version was released, and that was the version that got out over here. The original printing came with a soundtrack disc. It's another title that takes place in the wasteland. You get to see the end of the world and you survive it. You and some of your acquaintances, some of your friends make it through to this world state where the world is about to be reborn, and you are, just moving through the world and building up to an ending where you may or may not get to influence how the world is reborn. So it has a typical morality system where your actions kind of determine the ending. It's really hard. There's a bunch of event battles in it that are very difficult. Dante from Devil May Cry has a cameo in it. You fight him. It's a really neat crossover that you don't expect, but at the time, everyone knew Dante and no one knew Shin Megami Tensei over here, so that was a neat way to kind of get the hook into people. Like the Xbox game, it's fully 3D. All the dungeons are 3D. There's no more first-person dungeons, so that's cool. And in Japan, there was another special edition released. After the release of Devil Summoner, they went back and released an updated version of Nocturne, and this time they replaced Dante with Raidu, the main character of Devil Summoner, which is a cool tie-in to that series. In 2009, we got Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey for the DS. I've read the original developers debated about whether or not to name it Shin Megami Tensei 4, but they ended up going with Strange Journey and saving 4 for a later title. The launch edition came with a soundtrack, the game itself, and of course this little slipcase. It takes place in a really unique setting, so it's futuristic, but the world hasn't necessarily been destroyed. So in the story up in the Antarctic, this abyss is opening up and it's growing and growing, and so a team of researchers go out there to investigate this abyss and end up fighting the demons who start pouring out of it. So it's a really interesting take on this series. It's nice to have a good in-between point. A lot of the games either take place in modern Tokyo, in the wasteland, or combine the two, but this is one interesting one that's like, stuff is going down and you're trying to prevent it or figure out what's going on. The gameplay is a throwback to the original Shin Megami Tensei games. The dungeons are now in 3D again, and there's a much more of an emphasis on dungeon crawling. So again, it's another tough game. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei 4, which was released in this special edition, which comes with a strategy/art book, the game itself, and a soundtrack. Shin Megami Tensei 4 was released in 2009 for the 3DS, and it again features another really interesting setting. It features another really interesting setting for the series. It takes place in a more feudal Japan-like kingdom, and there's some technology there, but it's definitely a big departure from the other settings. The player controls a samurai named Flynn, who ends up fighting demons that are invading the kingdom. Flynn and his friends eventually figure out kind of what's going on, and the game takes a big turn partway through. Next up, which was released just last year in 2016, is Shin Megami Tensei Apocalypse. Again, for the 3DS, it is a direct continuation of Shin Megami Tensei 4, well, of one of the endings anyway, and it follows the story of a new character, although he runs into the characters of the previous game, and a lot of the threads from that game continue. There was no special edition for Apocalypse, but it did release with this pre-order bonus, which is a series of 3 pins, so, these are kind of nice, actually. Usually when they include this stuff, I just call it cosplay bait, but, these are kind of nice in general. While we're talking about Shin Megami Tensei 4, Udon started putting out some art books for the series, which is real nice, because there's not a lot of ancillary material for Shin Megami Tensei or its spin-offs. And this is a really nice art book that covers Shin Megami Tensei 4, so it's, for fans of the series, it's nice to have something like this. Now I'll quickly go through some of the other Japanese-only releases in the series. There's a 3-volume manga series called Shin Megami Tensei Gaiden Hoto no Senkei from 2001, and it features a main character who plays the game DDS Net, in which the players fight against demons. In 2011, there was a social RPG called Shin Megami Tensei Devil Hunter Zero. It's another first-person dungeon-crawling RPG where the player enters the Expanse and learns to summon demons and becomes a devil hunter. In 2013, Shin Megami Tensei Devil Collection came out. It was a cell phone social game where people could collect cards, they could fuse demons, and use those demons to attack each other. And that's all that we've got right now for Shin Megami Tensei. They've announced that 2 new games for the main series are in the works, one for the 3DS and one for the Switch. The announcement for the Switch game was pretty big. They made a big deal about saying, like, hey, Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, 3, and 4 are out, and this is going to be the next thing, so let's hope for 5, maybe remakes of some of the games that never came out over here. I'm looking forward to anything. So, so that's all about it for Shin Megami Tensei. Recently, an updated version of Strange Journey was announced for the 3DS entitled Deep Strange Journey. Thanks for checking out this part of our Shin Megami Tensei retrospective. We've got a couple episodes planned for this because there's so much content to go through. Persona is going to be a big one. The Devil Summoner stuff is going to be a big one. There's probably going to be 4 episodes total, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe to us and you'll get updates when the new ones come out, and thanks for your support. So until next time, go play some Persona 5.